Good evening. I'm Dana Cunningham, Dean of the Tisch College of Civic Life here at Tufts. I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's Tisch College Solomont Speaker Series forum with legendary activists, Reverend James Lawson Jr. and Kent Wong. It is wonderful to have so many members of the Tufts community joining us virtually for this evening's conversation on the power of nonviolence in a modern context, organizing for social justice and building a multiracial democracy. We're excited to hear about Reverend Lawson's and Kent Wong's new book. Before we get started, I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Africana Center, the Civic Studies Program, and the University Chaplaincy. Your generous collaboration, along with the support and leadership of the Susan and Alan Solomont Fund, make events like this one possible. I'm thrilled and honored to introduce Reverend James Lawson Jr. and Kent Wong. Reverend Lawson is one of the civil rights movement's leading theoreticians, tacticians, and teachers. He is a Methodist minister who taught nonviolent theory and practice to help launch the 1960s Nashville lunch counter sit-ins, the Freedom Rides, the Memphis sanitation strike, and worker and immigrant rights movements in Los Angeles. Reverend Lawson worked closely with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. He was King's teacher, and along with King, trained many future leaders of the movement, including John Lewis, Diane Nash, Marion Barry, and James Bevel. His work as a theologian, pastor, and social change activist has inspired hope and liberation for more than 60 years. I had the extraordinary good fortune of traveling with Reverend Lawson and Kent Wong to Montgomery, Alabama, to see the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, to sit with Reverend Lawson to hear firsthand about his work in the movement. It was personally transformative. Kent Wong is the director of UCLA Labor Center, a union attorney, and a labor activist. He has taught a course on nonviolence with Reverend Lawson for the past 20 years and has published books on the labor movement, immigrant rights, and the Asian American community. In their new book, Revolutionary Nonviolence, Organizing for Freedom, Lawson and Wong provide a crucial resource on the long history of nonviolent philosophy and how we can overcome violence and oppression through organized, direct action, charting a powerful roadmap for a new generation of activists. Their book provides a comprehensive introduction to Reverend Lawson's teachings on how to center nonviolence in successfully organizing for change. Some of you may know that Tisch College's aspirational North Star is building multiracial democracy. The collaboration between Reverend Lawson and Kent Wong, particularly around their support for dreamers, undocumented students, is a wonderful example of multiracial, multi-generational solidarity. Reverend Lawson and Kent Wong are joined this evening in conversation by Peter Levine, Associate Dean of Tisch College and Lincoln Filene Professor of Citizenship and Public Affairs, and the Program Director of the Civic Studies Program at Tufts. While Peter's primary appointment is at Tisch College, he also holds tenure as full professor in political science and many additional appointments across the university. He also co-leads the university-wide research group on equity in health, wealth, and civic engagement. Peter helped to found and then lead CIRCLE, the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, which is now part of Tisch College. He's the author of many, many books, including most recently, We Are the Ones We've Been Waiting For. Thank you to our guests for joining us. Before I turn over the conversation to Reverend Lawson, Kent, and Peter, we'll play a short video by way of introduction to Reverend Lawson's work and the incredible impact he's made throughout his career. This video is the trailer for Love and Solidarity, James Lawson and Nonviolence in the Search for Workers' Rights. It's a recent documentary that highlights Reverend Lawson's work and his work on labor rights with Kent. Following the trailer, I will welcome Reverend Lawson, Kent, and Peter to our virtual stage.
Our power has always been in ourselves, in our people. and in our unity, in the courage that we have to say no to racism and injustice.
The concept of nonviolence is a 20th century term coined by Mohandas Gandhi of India. Gandhi also goes on to say that love is power. It's the most creative power of the universe, and it's the greatest force, he says, that is available to humankind. And humankind needs to learn how to use it. A laborer deserves his wages. I think wages of people who do the work is an essential ingredient of justice and of community. I think the human species was created primarily to learn to work. Physical work, intellectual work, artistic work, community work, social work. We have to work as human beings because it feeds our dignity. It feeds our sense of making a contribution. It feeds our sense of taking care of ourselves. And so all work has dignity to it, as what Martin King said.
All labor has dignity.
I don't know.
And so work is not primarily for wages, but we ought to be able to benefit from our work, especially the work that we do outside of the home and in the larger community.
They cannot support the simple right of the ordinary man and woman in this society to have the full dignity of their work and their wages. And we must begin to tell the Democratic Party, stand up and be counted for human rights and for human dignity.
And with that, Peter, I turn it over to you and our guests.
Thanks, Dana. And well, it really is an honor and a privilege to be in this conversation. It's I'm going to remember this the rest of my life. And before I ask a first question, I did want to put in a good word for the book, which everybody needs to buy and which I commit to assign. This is the book, Revolutionary Nonviolence: Organizing for Freedom. I'll tell you just really briefly why I will assign it. I teach, in particular, a seminar on Martin Luther King, on his thought. And we read a lot of his writing, but we put it in the context of the action that he took, because all his colleagues took. So, of course, Reverend Lawson, you're already in our course and have been all along. But this is a remarkably valuable book for that kind of course and for many others. It's concise, it's rather short, it's eloquent, it's deep, it's thoughtful, it's clear. But also, and all those things are really true. It also, I think, is unique in the perspective, because you're able to talk about contemporary movements such as Black Lives Matter from the perspective of one of the architects of the freedom movement of the 50s and 60s and early 70s. And you're able to talk about those movements from the perspective of somebody who knows about today. And I don't think there's anything else like it. And I think our students will be tremendously benefit from that, and it'll help them actually to understand the history in a way that I don't think anything else does. So it's really a magnificent book. And so thank you for writing it, both of you, because Kent Wong is also involved in a very deep way. And thank you for joining us. If I may, I wanted to—
Thank you so much, Peter. That's a rather remarkable statement you've just made.
It's true. It's completely true. So I thought maybe we could start, and please, either of you answer. You both teach together, and either of you answer these questions. But the first one is really just asking you to talk about misconceptions people have about nonviolence. You talk about them in the book. I'll let you answer though. But just talk about what kind of misconceptions people have about nonviolence, if you would.
Well, the reason nonviolence is so revolutionary is because it turns on its head the propensity or even the obsession that we have that violence is the most powerful force in the world. and our use of violence for achieving all kinds of goals. Most of those goals, when we really look at their consequences, we've never achieved through violence. The Ukraine war is going to achieve violence and devastation and a displacement of millions of children and women who will be the big sufferers of it, but it will not produce healthy human beings, and it will not produce justice or freedom or community or a better nation, either Russia or Ukraine. That's the reality. But we have that passion that using violence gives us the greatest amount of power to make changes. Another idea about nonviolence that is so bad is that it's considered to be the way of the coward and of passivity. That you don't have to have the character of courage and a sense of what is true and just and beautiful, and therefore where your life has to stand on what is most valuable for your own life and for the lives of others. Another view of it is that it means doing nothing. Whereas in fact, for example,
Hi, sweetheart. How are you?
the best
I know.
The best self-defense is the self-defense that most of us humans use in building our character, our capacities to work, our dedication to our families, and so forth and so on. That is the best self-defense in the world. The best self-defense is a United States that has massive amounts of justice and truth for every baby born in the society. So those are at least three very quickly images of nonviolence. And of course, the fourth thing is that we have violence so much committed, we have a society so much committed to violence. We are the most violent culture in human history. It's hard for us to see that all across the country, there are all kinds of people, most families included, that raise their children through love and understanding and compassion and self-sacrifice. We don't realize the extent to which most human beings use the way of love and all in raising their families and wanting to see their families reach maturity.
What an additional misconception that you emphasize very well in the book, and it comes up a couple of times, is that nonviolence is based, and nonviolent movements are basically protest movements, and that protest is the core activity, and particularly marches. And I think I find that's a widely held misconception, that if you do nonviolence, you protest. And you point out that the Nashville movement, for example, was so much more than a series of protests. Is that something you'd want to expand on a little bit more? I mean, what else is there to nonviolence apart from protest?
Kent, do you want to take that?
I think that one of the misconceptions about nonviolence is that it is a philosophy of the past, that it was something that was useful and common during the freedom struggle of the 50s and 60s, but it is no longer a relevant force today. And indeed, I think that Reverend Lawson's teachings, especially here in Los Angeles over several decades, has been transformative in linking the philosophy of nonviolence to the practical movements for social justice and racial justice within Los Angeles and within California. And so, although Reverend Lawson's teachings have been very well documented, inspiring a new generation in Nashville and in Memphis and throughout numerous struggles throughout the South, what is less known is the extraordinary impact that Reverend Lawson has had in revitalizing the labor movement and in transforming the hotel workers and the Justice for Janitors movement and other labor struggles that have been grounded in a new generation of immigrant worker organizing. And so the power of nonviolence lives on, and it is being deeply applied in many, many fronts throughout the work that we see here in Los Angeles and in California.
Great. And yeah, I didn't want to imply that there was just two phases, the freedom movement of the 50s and 60s, and now there's obviously the ongoing work all the way through, which is documented in the book and which is super important. And there's a point in the book where you say that that what matters is the continued work as well. Would you like to, either of you, both of you, walk us through the 4 stages? So there's a beautiful picture in the book of Reverend Lawson in 1960 in Nashville with 6 stages written on the chalkboard behind it. He's teaching, and those are the Gandhian 6 stages. Now it's 4. I mean, obviously that's a matter of just categorizing a little bit. I think if you have the patience for it, you should tell everybody what the 4 stages are, and then they should buy the book and find out more details.
Well, actually, there are 100 volumes of Gandhi's writings, but none of them are a systematic exposure of his the stages of organizing or the tactics that he used. But basically, he did use some 11 various tactics. For an example, his first step for a movement was investigate the grievance, investigate the complaint thoroughly. In the 1947 and beyond, there were various people in the United States discussing how the Gandhian tactics and methodologies could be used and transformed. And eventually I was a part of that discussion in various ways, and eventually then turned the 11 steps that I can spell out that Gandhi did to 4. The first step being focus. And I chose the word focus, both because what you choose to do must have a priority in the campaign, and also because it is necessary to develop a discipline in struggle that you're not all over the place fighting all kinds of fires.
Right.
To have a campaign, you have to give it top priority. And then the second step was with step number 1, focus, you proceed also to see what the problems are and to begin a direct act campaign that will enable you to address those grievances. The second or third step could be negotiation, because in focus, you plan to see what the issues are, you see what could be done. And if there are places in the community where you can negotiate with people about them, or if it's a strike firm, if it's a corporation, you inform the president of the corporation you're about ready to declare a direct action campaign of some kind. And then the 4th step is follow up. The unions do this quite well. After every campaign, a responsible union will have a follow-up process by which they see to it that everything in the new contract is going to be carried out systematically and creatively. So the 4 steps.
Thank you. So turning to the present and to sort of movements that many of our students are involved with or certainly follow closely, you talk about them in the book a little, and particularly you name Black Lives Matter as one of the largest, most creative nonviolent movements that have captured the imagination of the human family. And I'm sure you know the research that shows that, in fact, something higher than 96% of all Black Lives Matter events have been strictly nonviolent, and of the remaining
Exactly.
4%.
Oh, yes, right. Mhm.
Even in the remaining 4%, it's often been outsiders or the police that have instigated the violence. But it strikes me that that's not the main way that people talk about the movement with the word nonviolence. Certainly critics don't. They try to paint it as very violent, but even friends and allies tend not to talk about it as nonviolent. Now, Patrice Cullors has got a blurb on the front of the book saying that this is the right book for the movement. So
Yeah.
there is obviously some sense. But I wonder, do you have a comment? I mean, maybe I'm wrong and I'm missing it, but are people forgetting about the terminology and the philosophy of nonviolence? Or are they, well, I should say that the movement is not nonviolent by accident. It's nonviolent by discipline and training and organization. So it's actually happening, but it's not being talked about quite that way. So do you see the things that way?
Certainly in the year 2021, where from May to August, they had demonstrations in more than 2,500 locations in the United States mostly, but also in other parts of the world. And where, according to the scholars, they involved somewhere between 15 and 25 million people. And this was the most diverse people demonstrations in the history of the United States. And it was indeed, according to many scholars, 96, 97% nonviolence, with most of the violence coming from police, looters, anarchists, organized group and organized groups that have for long across this country appeared in the demonstrations and others and walked their own way, not doing what the BLM wanted done last year. So it was highly effective. But I should say to you that that's the last major thing I've seen. I have talked locally to a number of people, and there's some small demonstrations going on in LA at the office of the police union. But basically, I am critical of BLM right now because the Democratic Party told them to stop demonstrating with the new administration.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that was entirely their own choice. I don't know. I've talked to several people, but have not received a clear picture of what happened. But I know that in the 60s, the Democratic administration was often telling us to get out of the streets, to stop the demonstration. They would do it. They have the message. They would get it done. Their failure to, I think they would have been wise to say we will not demonstrate in the first 100 days of the Biden administration, but then they should have picked up the cudgels again, because 2020, I mean 21, 22 has allowed the public discourse to be almost entirely dominated by the nonsense of a Republican Party growing in its confusion and chaos and in its lack of understanding of what it means to be human. And then also, in a lesser form, troubled by, well, let me say it another way. If BLM had been marching from May to March, May of 21 to March of 22, the public conversations would have been entirely different. The political discussion, the issues that people could see would have been entirely different from what we've had to endure.
That's interesting, and I don't think I've heard other people say that in that way. I think it's everybody should know that this book is basically very affirming of contemporary movements and of youth movements.
Yeah.
But you just gave a critical slant, which is very useful and important. And I wanted to bring up another one. You say there's lots of activism now, and the range of organizing is the greatest you've ever seen in your career. Quote, but people are not developing a thesis of social change that is both personally transforming and transforming a society and of the immediate social environment. And that is part of the power of nonviolent philosophy and theory. So they're not developing a thesis of social change. There's a lot in that sentence. In fact, I could put it in the chat in a minute, but I wondered if you could expand a little, because I think people want to know. Basically, people want to know what they need to work on.
We've continued to have more activism than we've ever had. Tens of thousands of nonprofit organizations committed to all kinds of issues of justice, equality, and liberty around the country. But they're approaching to much of that activism does not have a personal discipline around the issues of soul force or nonviolence, how you bring about social political change, how you do what Gene Sharp called, how you put into operation the pillar of conversion, how you put in the operation of the pillar of power that becomes a part of the power mix in a community or in a nation, so that power is not all from the power brokers or from the forces of oppression, because your movement has power in its strategy, in its people, in its demonstration of discipline. Too many activists run around on too many issues, and so many issues, you cannot blame them in one sense, because so many issues are interconnection. I maintain, for an example, that our society has been largely shaped by plantation capitalism, by violence, by sexism, male domination, chauvinism, and by racism. And these four forces of spiritual wickedness in our country are interrelated and interwoven and blend together. So it's no longer plainly racism as in the 60s. And it seems to me that activism is not caught up with this, and activism largely has not imposed a discipline that comes out of nonviolent struggle and comes out of the United States as an example, and therefore is not as effective as it could be.
If I could add, I think in the approach that Reverend Lawson and I have taken in our class, it is to look at the intersection and the link between personal transformation and societal transformation. And I think that the philosophy of nonviolence is deeply rooted in addressing and understanding that link, that indeed so many of the powerful social movements that we have witnessed and experienced have reflected that nexus of the personal transformation, the ability of workers, the ability of communities of color, the ability of young people to find their voice, to find their inner strength and power, and through a process of personal transformation have engaged in societal transformation. When we teach the class, we assign all of our students that the very best way to learn about the power of nonviolence is to practice nonviolence. And so we have them engage in major movements in the greater Los Angeles area that are deeply rooted in the power of nonviolence. Patrice Cullors, who gave us the quote on the book, is a graduate of UCLA, one of the three founders of Black Lives Matter. Opal Tometi, one of the three founders of Black Lives Matter, was a leader of the Black Alliance for Just Immigration to link issues of Black liberation and the immigrant rights movement, and to lift up the voices of Black undocumented immigrants that have, for so many years have been silent within our society. And so what we see now, I think, in terms of this wave of worker organizing, worker struggle among fast food workers, among Amazon workers, among Uber and Lyft drivers, is a reflection of a deep understanding, as Reverend Lawson has taught us, about plantation capitalism, that there are very few illusions that corporate America has the interests of the vast majority of working people at heart, and that it is up to workers themselves, it is up to immigrants themselves, it is up to young people themselves to find their inner strength and to get involved in the transformation of the society around them.
Yes, and one of the other things that is a part of that whole litany, Kent, as well, is the extent to which we insist that if I'm talking to a union, nonviolence begins with you. The way you treat yourself, the way you treat your family, the way you treat other members of the union, the way in which you make your decisions together in order to shape the union and to shape your success. So that in one way, that's true of every athletic team that plays baseball or football. They develop a discipline of care for themselves in their protracted struggle to be a sports person. So nonviolence does mean that, among other things, you stop using bad language toward each other. You try to treat each other with dignity. You
Yes,
work
and
hard to make decisions that have powerful consensual backgrounds.
And I think the book gives people some kind of on-ramps for living a nonviolent life in relatively small scale ways in just interpersonal relations, which is an important thing. I think you're both giving us a little window into the intergenerational dialogue that must happen in your classrooms. And it's more than 2 generations, it's a bunch of generations. So, and you've shown us a little bit about sort of what you've transmitted to the next generation. Do you want to talk, either of you, a little bit more about that? And particularly, I'm interested in what you learned from the younger people, and how much of that is sort of, the learning is going both ways, I'm guessing, and I'd love to hear more about that.
I'll lead off and then I'll turn it over to Reverend Lawson. We are deeply committed to a notion of a school to movement pipeline, that we think as a public university that we have an obligation and a responsibility to provide pathways where young people can find true meaning in their lives through embracing nonviolence and a approach that advances social justice, economic justice, and racial justice. And if I could just highlight the extraordinary impact that Reverend Lawson's teachings have had on a particular group of our students, and those are our undocumented immigrant students, that when, for now 20 years, some of the leading immigrant youth in UCLA have enrolled in our class. And when they see the images of the lunch counter sit-ins back in the 1960s that desegregated cities throughout the South, they see themselves in those chairs. They see themselves as agents of change. And they don't see this as a historic documentary. They see this as a story that speaks to them here and now. And so we have seen the extraordinary work of undocumented immigrant youth movement who have declared that they are undocumented and unafraid, and who have embraced the philosophy of nonviolence, risking arrest and deportation, and demanding substantive change in immigration policy, including deferred action for childhood arrivals and the passage of the California DREAM Act, which has literally benefited hundreds of thousands of immigrants throughout the country. But in many ways, some of the leaders of that movement have been inspired and motivated by Reverend Lawson and by the teachings of nonviolence.
Thank you. We're getting towards the point, I just want to say to the audience, where we will welcome your questions. So you should type them in the Q&A box if you have questions, and we'll begin to segue. We have one, and we'll have a few more, and we'll segue to those. But I have a few more in the meantime, and particularly I wanted to ask about the current war. Reverend Lawson, you mentioned it. One angle on it, which is that the Putin government is not going to get what it wants from violence. But I'm wondering about the potential here for nonviolence. And I did want to share, I've had the privilege of working in Ukraine and with Ukrainians since for the last 7 years. And the thing that I wanted to share with you is that the strong democracy advocates in Ukraine are deeply inspired by and very knowledgeable about the American freedom movement. We at one point we had we were honored by a visit from the late John Lewis to Tisch College. So, I mean, he wasn't visiting me, of course, but I was in the group that I took. I got a picture taken, so I put it on my Facebook page, and all these Ukrainians were asking me to tell him, which I couldn't do because he was gone, but asking me to tell him specific things about what they knew about him or about his work. And they of course have had now 10 or 15 years of pretty sustained nonviolent social movement activism. So I'm wondering about prospects for nonviolence in Ukraine, prospects for nonviolence in Russia, and just how you think about it as such experienced people when there's a war and when there's a very bad actor in a case like this.
Well, after the war begins and you're being defeated and what's the word? Defeated, killed, your territory being shattered and broken and busted and all the rest of it, and create a whole huge problem of the well-being of the people. It seems to me that I think that then the movement has to move to become a nonviolent movement. In the midst of conquest, may be hard to do. But there is one illustration off of the European scene that I know of, the country of Denmark, because they knew they were going to be blasted by the German military, surrendered to the country before their country was devastated. And then that allowed for a great variety of forms of resistance. Some of them became nationalist, and it became national resistance enterprises. For example, they were able to organize underground and keep their Jewish citizens alive, ship them off to Sweden, so that only a handful of Danish Jewish people who were captured by the Germans or were picked up by the Germans, it would say the Nazis, the SS, and sent off to death camps and so forth and so on. So they started, it's a mixed story, because Danish underground units and Allied units did sabotaging too with it. But it is a story, at least, of how one people turned to essentially a resistance that was not primarily a violent resistance, but it can be done. And I would hope I hope personally that as this war proceeds, nonviolent resistance can take place, and it cannot take place in large groups, and it cannot initially take place above the ground. It's going to have to take place in small groups initially until there's a sufficient knowledge and experience and numbers that it can become quite visible. So it almost entirely has to be done at this moment in Ukraine in an underground fashion, in an invisible fashion. And there has to be a sharp discipline that it must be underground. It must be completely hidden, even from your own family. As you learn what to do, as you learn to develop the unity and the consensus, and you learn then the tasks that will help you change the scene.
Even in the violent chaos of the present moment, there are people posting lots and lots of videos of nonviolent opposition to Russian soldiers.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, it's
going on.
Yeah. I'm going to start to segue into some of the questions that are coming in from colleagues and just the audience, and I might add a few as well. So Sarah Suzuki says, knowing that higher education is built on a legacy of violence, of settler colonialism, of racism, of supporting war and conflicts across the ages, what does nonviolence in higher education look like? And that would certainly be a question for either or both of you.
Reverend Lawson and I have frequently lamented the lack of nonviolence courses and curriculum that exist in universities throughout the country. And we lament the fact that there are ROTC chapters and ROTC presence in colleges and universities all across the country. And yet there is relatively few that offer peace studies and nonviolence as a curriculum. And I do think that we have to challenge the imbalance that exists within the university structure that historically has privileged people based on class and racial bias, and that the transformation within the university system, whether it be through the establishment of ethnic studies, women's studies, LGBT studies, the advances of affirmative action and demanding full representation of underserved communities. I think these are all reflections of an attempt to democratize the university, but it always takes a struggle. And the building you see behind me is a symbol of a struggle that resulted in a significant victory. In December of 2021, the UCLA Labor Center purchased our building, which we had rented for 20 years. And in December of 21, we renamed our building the James Lawson Jr. Worker Justice Center. So I think that's a very powerful symbol of what the role of a public university should be. Should it be to enhance the wealth of corporate America? Should it be to establish R&D programs that benefit the wealthy few? Or indeed, should it be rooted in working class communities with a defined mission of public service to those historically who have been underserved within the university? And so the fact that we drive by our building now, and on the outside it says the UCLA James Lawson Jr. Worker Justice Center, in my mind is a huge breakthrough and victory for those of us who embrace nonviolence within the academy.
Congratulations.
In college, I did not learn in American history the stories of Lucy Burns and Alice Paul and the more militant wing of the women's suffrage movement that in 10 years accomplished what the movement had not been accomplished from 1837. And they did it against the strain and the grain of the suffrage movement. The suffrage movement had 7 million people. They were still debating among themselves how to get the amendment that they had the right to vote. These two very young women organized other young women like themselves into the National Women's Political Party. And as the World War I happened, they took a stance of picketing the White House, cutting up the speeches of Woodrow Wilson and burning them in a barrel with fire, and saying to Woodrow Wilson, the major struggle for democracy is not in World War I or on the battlefields of Europe, but in getting the women the right to vote in the United States. So that in less than 2 or 3 years, Woodrow Wilson changed his mind, went before both houses of Congress and called for the right of women to vote, and called for what I think became the 19th Amendment. And so this was just celebrated a couple of years ago. In less than a year, it was ratified by the 37 states they needed. More than 600 women were arrested and put into a fierce Virginia work camp. And they started a hunger strike, but it put the right to vote on the national front pages. And it changed the mind of Congress and got passed. Now, so that's one example, but it wasn't taught when I found that on my own. When I went to college, the Underground Railroad I never learned about the Underground Railroad, which was a first massive resistance movement to slavery and largely nonviolent, rooted in the music of the Negro spiritual and in the spiritual values of what it meant to them as they were. The music that they composed, that they were forced to compose, was anti-slavery. It said we are not slaves, and it said it in mythology and disguise. We are not slaves. We are children of God. It helped to start then. The Underground Railroad, from the beginning, it became a part of that, where people went into Mexico or in the swamps of Florida, or ran off, as my great-great-grandfather did, ran out of somewhere in Virginia, maybe, into Canada.
Yep.
So those are two massive forms of nonviolence, but they're not being taught out of American history. I'll give you a third example. They're not in the books. In the 17th century, Lord William Penn was a great naval hero in Great Britain, and the king would do anything for him. He was an admiral in the Navy. His son was converted to Quakerism. Quakerism was being persecuted as a bad religion, an anti-God religion in England. The king gave William Penn the son, in order to save his life, the eastern part of Pennsylvania as a colony. 1681, William Penn wrote to the Indians. He found out who the Indians were, the tribes were, who the chiefs were. He wrote them saying, we are coming to live there, but we're coming to live as your sisters and brothers. We will not steal the land. We will live side by side with you. We see you as like ourselves. We are all children of the light and children of God. For 75 years, when Pennsylvania stayed in the hands of Quaker political control, not a settler was killed, not an Indian was killed. There were no Indian wars in that part of Pennsylvania, while wars raged all around them in the taking of the land. So those are just three illustrations that I know of in American history, but none of these things are taught. Now, I'm going to give a fourth example, because 1765 started the struggle in the 13 colonies for independence. They refused to pay taxes. This is now in books. They refused to pay taxes. They would not pay the transaction taxes for doing business. They refused to wear British manufactured clothing. They refused to house the British occupying troops, women started sewing clubs in order to make clothing for one another and themselves. In other words, that 1765 to 1775 is not yet in the American history books. Fundamentally, according to the third president, John Adams, that struggle caused all the 13 colonies to say, we do not need a king. We can govern ourselves. So that's another illustration. There was a 9-year campaign that was essentially a nonviolent campaign. It is not in most of our history books.
We had a question in the question and answer about what students should be learning and studying, and I'm going to ask a different one instead. But I think one contribution you have to that question is they should be learning the history of revolutionary nonviolence, right?
That's right. Exactly.
As an effective. We only have a couple minutes left. I think we should ask a question about unions and labor, because you've both been deeply immersed in that, in Reverend Lawson's case, at least since the Memphis strike. But you've both been deeply involved. So the question that we got from Steve is, what needs to happen for a progressive labor movement to reverse the 50-year trend of declining union membership? Tough question. That might be our last.
I'll take the lead. This is a very long question. It's a very important one. And so I do think that this is the beginning of this conversation, and I hope that we have an opportunity to continue it. Fundamentally, we have to change the very nature of the US labor movement that currently exists as an exclusive club, and that we have to open up the doors of the US labor movement to allow workers to join. And as simple as that may sound, it is not. And currently, it exists as a private club because you have to be a member of a collective bargaining unit that will go against the horrendous anti-union labor laws that exist in this country and secure an election victory. And even then, it may take years before you get a contract, if at all. And so at a time when there is a new wave of strikes, of protests, of worker organizing in historically unorganized workplaces, this is a time when we need to redefine the role of the US labor movement and open up its doors to build a true workers' movement. The largest May Day demonstration in US history took place in 2006, led by millions and millions of undocumented immigrant workers. The vast majority were not members of US unions. And the transformation we have seen in the Los Angeles and California labor movements have in many instances been led by undocumented immigrant workers who represent in many ways the hope and future for the labor movement, but historically have been excluded from union membership by many conservative unions. And so we need a radical transformation within the labor movement, within the university, and within our society at large through the embrace of nonviolence.
And Los Angeles has, for 25 years now, become a place where union membership is growing. Democratic Union calling themselves unions for justice, unions for all our people, all our families, is on the increase. And also then unions in the new field, like the healthcare workers union, 500,000 people across the state now in that union alone. So we in LA, I think, are an illustration of how the union movement can, and now I will say another word about that. United States will never have a democratic society if there is not genuine economic justice for all the people in every kind of work, in the work environment, and safety, and all the rest of it. Jesus of Nazareth, the great prophet, and I'm wipe away the mythologies that I don't accept anyway, but Jesus, the huge prophet, illustrating the finest religion possible in the world, coming out of the Hebrew Bible. Jesus of Nazareth says, the laborer deserves his wages. I think that's in Luke 10, in the book Luke, chapter 10, verse 10. The laborer deserves his wages. Another man by the name of Jesus, 180 years before the Jesus of Nazareth, was Jesus of Syriac, writes in his book that when you deprive a laborer of his wages, you commit murder. This is a Jewish teacher, again, 180 years before the Jesus of Nazareth, both of them insisting that economic justice has to be the right of every working person.
That may be essentially the wonderful way to end. It also ties back to the short film we saw where you were, Reverend Lawson, you were talking about the dignity of work. We've got these questions, and I'll just say we've got these questions in the Q&A that are now more about specific issues. For example, about nonviolence to protect the vote, and about policing and whether in fact we even need police. And well, we don't have time to address these issues. But I think there would be even more if we were together in person and could keep talking. It would be one issue after another. I do want to invite people to read the book, which won't tell you about those specific issues, but it will give you more of a framework for understanding a philosophy, a theology of revolutionary nonviolence. And it's also extremely well written, obviously eloquent, and very substantive, and just really valuable. And we will be reading it in Tufts classrooms. And I mean, people will have to read it because I'm going to sign it, but I also think they will very much enjoy it. And so with that, I think we just need to thank you both very much, and certainly both of you. We appreciate you both. And it's been a great honor and pleasure as well to have you here at Tufts, even though it's virtual.
Our pleasure as well. Thank you so much, Peter.
Thank you both, and a good evening to you.